This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Brilliant, for those who don't already know, is a website and app built on the idea of active problem solving. Because it takes more to learn something than just watching it. To really learn something, you have to do it. This is why Brilliant has tons of lessons on its platform for lifelong learners who aren't content to just coast through adulthood with the skills they learned in primary school. For example, have you ever wanted to learn how computer programming works but were put off by the intimidating coding language? Well, Brilliant can help you learn how to program without having to dig deep through the weeds of coding syntax, thanks to fun, interactive challenges. Brilliant users can shift around blocks of pseudocode, then get immediate feedback on their results. It's an engaging way to understand how computer algorithms work, and once you've got that down, the coding syntax becomes a lot less intimidating. On Brilliant, it's not about memorizing or regurgitating facts for a test. You can just pick a course you're interested in and get started. Feeling stuck, afraid you made a mistake? It's never an issue here. You can read the explanations to find out more and then learn at your own pace. Brilliant! So if you're a lifelong learner who wants to give Brilliant a try, you guys can get a free trial plus 20% off the cost of a year's subscription by following the link in the description below. And now today's video. On February the 6th, 2017, 46-year-old Kim Jong-nam was waiting at his departure gate at Kuala Lumpur International Airport on his way to the Malaysian resort island of Langkawi. At 10:50 a.m., he was approached by a pair of women who proceeded to splash an unknown liquid in his face. The effects were immediate and dramatic. Kim's pupils shrank to pinpricks. He began to sweat and salivate profusely, and within seconds had lost consciousness, managing to stumble to a nearby ticket counter before collapsing. Paramedics soon arrived on the scene, but despite immediate and intensive medical intervention, Kim died en route to a nearby hospital. The two attackers, 28-year-old Vietnamese citizen Duan Thi Thuong and 25-year-old Indonesian citizen Siti Aisyah, claimed that they were participating in a prank for a Malaysian television show. In reality, the two women were part of a hit squad organized by Kim's half-brother, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Once the heir apparent to the North Korean leadership, Kim Jong-nam had fallen out with and become vocally critical of the regime, marking him for assassination. But what of the mysterious liquid that so quickly and horrifically ended Kim's life? A police investigation soon determined it to be a substance called VX, a class of highly potent chemical weapons known as nerve agents. First developed by the Nazis during World War II, nerve agents are among the most insidious and frighteningly widespread weapons of mass destruction in today's global military arsenal. The modern age of chemical warfare began during the Great War of 1914 to 1918. While the first use of chemical weapons in warfare is usually given as the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, in reality the Germans had used shells filled with the tear gas xyl or bromide against the Russians 3 months earlier at the Battle of Bolimov. Unfortunately for the Germans, the harsh winter temperatures caused the gas to freeze solid in the shells, and the attack was unsuccessful. A year earlier, Nobel Prize-winning German chemist Fritz Haber has approached the German military and recommended the use of chlorine gas to break the deadlock of trench warfare. Chlorine, an industrial byproduct, was not only cheap and available in massive quantities, but was also heavier than air, allowing it to seep along the ground and into trenches. It was this gas, released from cylinders, which the Germans deployed against the French lines at Ypres on the morning of April the 22nd, 1915. The world's first poison gas attack proved devastatingly effective, the French territorial and colonial troops fleeing in terror as the menacing yellow-green cloud rolled across no man's land towards them. Those who could not flee and were enveloped by the crowd were immediately beset by violent coughing and choking as the corrosive gas burned their eyes, throat, and lungs. In response to this irritation, the victims' bodies pumped their lungs full of mucus, causing many of them to drown in their own fluids. While the Entente powers swiftly condemned Germany for this barbaric new weapon of war, 5 months later the British responded in kind at the Battle of Loos, kicking off a deadly chemical arms race. Throughout the rest of the conflict, scientists on both sides raced to develop ever more effective gas masks and other defensive measures, as well as ever nastier chemical agents and delivery systems to counter the enemy's defenses. War, everybody. These weapons mainly fell into one of three categories: tear gases like the aforementioned xyl or bromide, asphyxiating gases like chlorine or the even deadlier phosgene, and vesicants or blister agents. Vesicants, which include mustard gas and lewisite, are not gases but rather oily liquids which, when splashed on the skin, inflict horrific chemical burns. Severe exposure can produce other toxic effects, and for more on how these effects eventually led to a major medical breakthrough, please see our previous video, That Time Poison Gas Saved Millions of Lives. In the end, poison gas was not the decisive weapon Fritz Haber had envisioned, accounting for less than 1% of all battlefield deaths. But its long-term physical and psychological effects were significant, with some 185,000 personnel from the British Empire alone returning home blind, horribly burned, or with permanently scarred lungs. The horrific sight of gas casualties spurred many nations to seek an international ban on chemical weapons, and on June 17, 1925, 38 nations signed the Geneva Protocol for the prohibition of the use of weapons of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases. Yet despite the signatories' good intentions, as with so many international treaties, it did not take long for the Geneva Protocol to be completely ignored. Several countries carried on manufacturing and stockpiling chemical agents through the 1920s and 1930s, while some, including Spain, Italy, and Japan, used them against rebels and civilians in their colonial territories of Morocco, Ethiopia, and Taiwan. Yet despite this 20-year development period, most belligerent nations went into the Second World War with essentially the same chemical weapons that they'd used in the First, with only minor additions and improvements. But this all began to change in the late 1930s, thanks to an accidental discovery in Germany. In 1936, chemist Dr. Gerhard Schrader of the German chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate IG Farben was experimenting with a group of chemicals known as organophosphates in order to develop a more effective insecticide for German agriculture. On December 23rd, he synthesized a compound called Preparation 991, which proved particularly potent, killing leaf lice and other crop pests at concentrations as low as 5 parts per million. However, it quickly became apparent that 991 was in fact too potent, with exposure to even tiny amounts of vapor inflicting upon Schrader and his colleagues a variety of frightening symptoms, including dilation of the pupils and shortness of breath. But though 991 was far too toxic for use as an insecticide, Schrader immediately recognized its potential as a chemical weapon and reported his findings to the Ministry of War. He also gave his deadly discovery a new name, Taban, from the German word for taboo. In May 1937, the Chemical Weapons Division at the Army Weapons Office at Spandau, Berlin, analyzed a sample of Taban provided by Schrader, and in 1939 they approved the construction of a pilot-scale manufacturing plant at Raubkammer outside Munster. Once the kinks in the manufacturing process had been ironed out, in January 1940 the Army constructed a full-scale plant, codenamed Hochwerk, at Dianfurth am Oder in occupied Poland. The factory, however, did not actually begin producing Taban until June 1942, the delay being due to the extremely complex and hazardous nature of the manufacturing process. Many intermediate compounds were so corrosive that they could only be contained in quartz or silver-lined vessels, while the final product was so toxic that it was stored in double glass-walled containers with air constantly circulated between the walls to whisk away stray vapor. As an additional safety measure, the 3,000-strong workforce were equipped with gas masks and triple-layer rubber suits and made to discard their clothing after every 10th wearing. Yet despite these precautions, over 300 accidents and 10 worker deaths occurred before full-scale production even began. Meanwhile, IG Farben continued to develop ever more potent organophosphate-based weapons, including sarin, discovered in 1938 and named after its inventors Gerhard Schrader, Otto Ambras, Gerhard Ritter, and Hans-Jürgen van der Linde. Sarin was followed in 1944 by even more potent sermon discovered by Nobel laureate Richard Kuhn, and in 1949 silosarin discovered once again by Gerhard Schrader. Sarin production was established at the Dianfurth plant and a brand new plant at Falkenhagen, and by the end of the war the Germans managed to produce and stockpile around 12,000 tons of Taban and 10 tons of sarin, loaded into tens of thousands of artillery shells and aircraft bombs. Yet, despite their destructive potential, none of these new potent chemical agents ever saw combat during the war. Numerous explanations have been put forward for Germany's reluctance to engage in chemical warfare, from the fact that Adolf Hitler himself had been gassed during the First World War to the simple fear of retaliation in kind by the Allies, who had similarly amassed massive stockpiles of shells and bombs filled with mustard gas and other chemical agents. But another more intriguing reason was put forward by Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring during the Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1946. According to Göring, by 1944 severe fuel shortages had made German ground forces almost entirely dependent on horses for transport. While horses could be fitted with gas masks and other protective equipment, in practice this caused them to lie down and stubbornly refuse to move until the mask was removed. Thus, the use of chemical weapons would have completely paralyzed much of the German transport network. Whatever the reason, the end of the war left the Taban and sarin factories intact for Allied analysts to discover and inspect, and they were extremely disturbed and impressed by what they found. Unlike older chemical weapons which irritate or burn bodily tissue, nerve agents like tabun, sarin, and soman, as well as cyclosarin, work by interfering with the function of the central nervous system. In order for nerve signals to pass from neuron to neuron, or from a neuron cell to a muscle or gland, they must cross a tiny gap known as a synapse. This is accomplished via special messenger chemicals known as neurotransmitters, including one known as acetylcholine. When a nerve signal reaches the end of the neuron, it stimulates the release of acetylcholine molecules which cross the synaptic cleft and lock into special receptors on the other side, passing along the signal. However, once an acetylcholine molecule has accomplished its task, it must immediately be deactivated, otherwise the neuron will simply continue firing. This, in turn, is accomplished by an enzyme known as acetylcholinesterase, which breaks down acetylcholine into acetate and choline molecules, which are reabsorbed by the transmitting neuron and recombined into new acetylcholine, a process known as neurotransmitter reuptake. Nerve agents like tabun and sarin work by binding to and interfering with the action of acetylcholinesterase. In the absence of this key enzyme, acetylcholine molecules continue to accumulate on their receptors, causing all the body's neurons to start firing at once, resulting in the distinctive symptoms of nerve gas poisoning: dilation of the pupils, excessive sweating and salivation, headache, respiratory distress, unconsciousness, muscle spasms, convulsions, respiratory paralysis, and ultimately death. Unlike older choking gases, nerve agents do not need to be inhaled and are easily absorbed through the skin, making protection against them far more difficult. They are also many times more toxic than blister agents and other common poisons like cyanide, with as little as 100 milligrams being enough to kill a grown man. However, despite what the 1996 Michael Bay film The Rock would have you believe, nerve agents do not typically exhibit face-melting corrosive effects. But while nerve agents are extremely difficult to defend against, there does exist an antidote of sorts. Atropine is a toxic alkaloid produced by several plants of the nightshade family, including deadly nightshade, Jimson weed, and mandrake. Since the end of the Second World War, atropine has been widely used as a treatment for poisoning by military nerve agents and organophosphate-based pesticides. It works by binding to the acetylcholine receptor sites in the victim's synapses, preventing the neurons from firing continuously. Atropine is also typically administered with the drug praxdoxamine, which binds to the acetylcholinesterase and displaces the attached nerve agent molecule, restoring the enzyme to normal function. The sedative Valium is also sometimes administered as an anticonvulsant. Early in the Cold War, soldiers were issued atropine in the form of syrettes, small toothpaste-style tubes with an attached hypodermic needle. Atropine pills were also issued for prophylactic use prior to a chemical attack. Later, however, the United States Army introduced the auto-injector or combi pen, a pen-like device that automatically injects a dose of atropine and pralidoxamine when pressed against a soldier's body. This invention would later be adapted into the EpiPen carried by those with severe allergies. But while a timely atropine injection can save a nerve agent victim's life, it is not a permanent solution. The drug wears off after about 15 minutes, and if the nerve agent is still present in the environment or the victim's system, then the toxic effects will quickly resume. Thus, it is often necessary to continue injecting the victim with atropine until all the nerve agent is naturally eliminated from their body. Furthermore, atropine itself is highly toxic and can kill if injected in the absence of nerve agents. Indeed, when Iraq launched a concerted missile attack against Israel during the 1991 Gulf War, up to 70 Israeli citizens believing the missiles had chemical warheads died after injecting themselves preemptively with atropine. And before you ask, no, it is not necessary to inject the atropine directly into the heart like Nicolas Cage does in The Rock. Injecting it into the thigh works just fine. As the Second World War gave way to the Cold War, both NATO and Eastern Bloc countries were quick to integrate nerve agents into their arsenals. In 1945, the Soviet Union captured the operating sarin plant at Darnforth and another nearly complete plant at Falkenhagen. And by 1946, both plants had resumed full-scale production. The United States captured many German chemical weapons experts as part of Operation Paperclip and manufactured sarin until 1957, while the United Kingdom conducted extensive research on sarin and other German nerve agents at its top-secret weapons research facility at Portendown in Wiltshire. Some of this research involved human experimentation, wherein military volunteers were exposed to milligram quantities of sarin, soman, and tabun, and had their blood drawn and analysed to gauge the effects and determine the minimum lethal dose. While most of these tests were carried out without incident, on May 6, 1953, 23-year-old Royal Air Force leading aircraft man Ronald Madison suffered an unexpectedly severe reaction and died barely 45 minutes after being exposed to sarin. His death was hastily covered up by the UK government and remained top secret for more than 50 years, whereupon an inquest was finally reopened and Madison's surviving relatives were awarded £100,000 in compensation by the Ministry of Defence. By the time of Madison's death, however, the first generation of nerve agents was already becoming obsolete. In November 1952, chemists Ranajit Ghosh and J.F. Newman at the British firm Imperial Chemical Industries discovered a new, extremely potent organophosphate compound, which in 1954 was marketed as an insecticide under the brand named Amaton. However, as with Tabun back in 1936, a series of near-lethal accidents revealed Amaton to be extremely toxic to humans, and the product was quickly pulled from the market. The Ministry of Defence scientists at Porton Down continued to experiment with the compound, and by 1955 had refined a brand new family of nerve agents known as the V series, which included VG, the military code name for Amaton, VM, VE, and VX, short for Venomous Agent X. The older German nerve agents were subsequently redesignated as the G series, GA for Tabun, GB for sarin, GD for soman, and GF for silosarin. The V series is even more lethal than the G series, with VX in particular having a lethal dose 10 times smaller than sarin. VX is also far more persistent than older nerve agents, meaning it does not evaporate or break down for long periods of time and can thus more easily be used as an area denial weapon. Consequently, the V series quickly became the de facto standard for nerve agents on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Between 1961 and 1969, the United States manufactured around 4,400 tons of VX, placing it in dozens of different weapons, including artillery shells, rockets, aerial bombs, and landmines. While exact numbers are hard to come by, the Soviet stockpile of V-series agents is expected to have been 10 times larger than that. However, as in the wake of the First World War, the horrifying destructive potential of these chemical stockpiles quickly became far too apparent, and in 1969 the United States shut down its chemical weapons program and began disposing of its stockpiles, dumping 112 tons of VX-filled weapons into the ocean off the coast of New Jersey and Florida. This operation was given the rather amusing name Chase, short for cut holes and sink 'em. This disposal process was further expedited when, on January 13, 1993, delegates from 165 nations gathered in The Hague to sign the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling, and Use of Chemical Weapons, and on their destruction, more commonly known as the Chemical Weapons Convention, or CWC. After the CWC came into force in 1997, the signatories declared global stockpiles of some 19,586 tons of VX nerve agents and agreed to destroy them. On December 4, 2008, the United States declared it had eliminated the last of its chemical weapons stockpile. Russia followed suit in November 2017, announcing it had destroyed its 40,000-ton arsenal. But while larger nations have been quick to eliminate their chemical stockpiles, the destructive power of nerve agents has proven far too alluring to smaller nations. Compared to nuclear or biological weapons, chemical weapons are relatively simple and cheap to manufacture and relatively targeted in their effects, giving cash-strapped nations the greatest bang for their buck. High-profile uses of nerve agents in combat include by Cuban forces during the Angolan Civil War in the 1970s and by Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein against the Kurds of northern Iraq in the 1980s. In one incident, on March 16, 1988, Iraqi aircraft dropped a lethal combination of mustard gas, Tabun, sarin, VX on the Kurdish city of Halabja, killing up to 5,000 civilians and wounding 10,000 more. More recently, the Syrian regime of President Bashar al-Assad has used sarin against rebel fighters and civilians on at least 4 occasions in 2013, 2017, and 2018. Nerve agents have also found use as tools for targeted assassination. After the Second World War, former Third Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production Albert Speer claimed to have contemplated assassinating Adolf Hitler by releasing Tabun, a sarin, into an air vent in the Fuhrer's Berlin bunker. Unfortunately, Hitler had a 3-meter-high chimney built over the vent before the plot could be carried out. More recent years have seen not only the aforementioned assassination of Kim Jong-nam by North Korea, but also the attacks on Russian ex-spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in 2018, and on the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny in 2020, both believed to have been carried out by a 4th-generation nerve agent known as Novichok. So cheap and easy are nerve agents to manufacture that even small terrorist groups have managed to get their hands on them. On March the 20th, 1995, the Japanese doomsday cult Shinrikyo launched a pair of attacks on Matsumoto and the Tokyo subway system using homemade sarin gas carried in plastic bags, which the attackers punctured with sharpened umbrellas. Despite the sarin used being relatively impure, the attack still managed to kill 14 people and injure or temporarily blind nearly 1,000 more. 9 months earlier, a similar attack on the city of Matsumoto killed 8 and injured 500. Al-Qaeda is also believed to have at one point owned stockpiles of VX, allegedly manufactured at the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan. It is currently unknown how many countries possess nerve agent stockpiles or just how large those stockpiles are, but as recent attacks on Kim Jong-nam, Sergei and Yulia Skripal and Alexei Navalny dramatically demonstrate, these legacies of Nazi-era chemical research remain a clear and present danger in the world today. Just one more creatively nasty way that we humans have come up with for killing one another. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.